This is Art with Bob Pincus. We're at the Timken Museum of Art, standing on the backside of the museum, but we're going to go around the front side, and we're excited to see an exhibition called Poetic Portraits, Renaissance-era portraiture, which features a Renaissance painter, Sofonisba Anguissola, one of the great portrait painters of the Renaissance. You may notice, looking at where I'm standing, this is a modern-era building. Opened in 1965. All the other buildings at Balboa Park where this museum stands are in a kind of vintage Spanish style. But it certainly fits the collection, which is old master paintings, Russian icons, also American art. There were two women, Amy and Ann Putnam, sisters, and they were avid collectors of old master paintings. And so they took their collection, kept building it, and then they gave to this museum when it opened. A very good collection which has been built upon ever since. The Timken is very strong in portraits. With the Renaissance, you had the idea of humanism, right? And the idea of portraits of individuals being representing their individuality. And so then the portrait goes from being less of a profile portrait to more of a full face or three-quarter face portrait, because you're trying to represent what someone really looks like. This portrait of Giovanni Battista Castelli from the Prado in Madrid. He's a poet from Cremona, which is where she was from. And so it wants to represent him as a very learned man. You know, you have the book of poetry, he's got the pen out, so we assume he's going to be writing something. If not in that book, he's going to be writing something soon. He's got the nice pile of books on his desk. He also has a painting on the wall, which would signify, of course, that he's cultivated in terms of the arts, but also that he's religious, as he should be, right? In his period. That's what they would want to represent as. And so he was a prominent citizen of that time in that city. But the idea, of course, is to represent him with the things, the props that identify him, like as the kind of person he was, which is part of the point of the show, right? Because it talks about identity in 16th century Europe. So it's trying to give the person his identity, not only as a person, but as what he does as a person. One of the interesting things is that for centuries, they didn't identify who he was. Apparently, they had painted this cloak of his a dark color. I don't know what that symbolized, but anyway, they thought it was a representation of St. Peter. And so only through recent conservation and research, they realized that no, it's not supposed to be St. Peter, it's supposed to be this fellow. So then they took that dark color off, and you see his cloak in the original color. Oh yeah, this little painting is going to be added to the show. And this is another case of a painting that had been attributed to a different artist, to Alonso Sanchez Coello. But the curator in 2015, who was working at the Museum of Art, really good curator, John Marciari, said, no, this is a painting by Anguissola, and he had very persuasive evidence. So now they reattributed it, and it's a portrait of a Spanish prince, but it's when he was very young, who's going to become Philip II, soon to be in charge, as we were. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they've ever been in the same spot. Bartolomeo Veneto, portrait of a lady in a green dress, has been in the collection since 1979. As I understand it, for centuries, it wasn't even identified as his painting. Only in recent decades were many of his paintings identified as his. This painting, they still don't know who the person is in the painting. I think people have always loved this painting because it has kind of an interesting way she looks at you. Look at the way her eyes are sort of following you if you go to the right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and almost like looking at you sideways, right? I don't know what this signifies, but apparently these sleeves that she had were because she was a falconer, so the bird could land, I suppose, right? Yeah. His reputation has risen over time as a painter. Biographically, very little is still known about him. They know he was active from about 1502 to about 1532. Painting holds up even if you don't know who it is, right? Just because of the presence of the person in the painting. And although he's not obviously considered at the level of like Da Vinci or, you know, that kind of level of Renaissance, he's considered now major Renaissance portrait painter, like Anguissola. You can see down to the little cross-stitching. There's no detail, obviously, that he left off. I mean, even the rings are down to the last little. And you gotta love the hair. This fellow, Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio, was a star pupil of Da Vinci. It's really meant to evoke the idea of kind of a symbolic portrait, right? Because he's holding an arrow and he's wearing a laurel leaf crown. You can see up there, right? And he's an arrow, both of which are supposed to be kind of in that time symbolizing poetry. We're going to assume that we feel like this portrait is meant to represent somebody who was literary, right? In that time. Or he's holding an arrow, it looks like, but he's holding it almost like a reed pen, the way he holds it. Yeah, contrasting the red and the black. Yeah, one time actually I was reminded it was considered to be a work by Leonardo, but then reattributed to Mr. Boltraffio. Of course, if it was Da Vinci, everybody would stand in ooh and ah. But if it's a Boltraffio, they go, oh, that's interesting. This is the one contemporary work in the show. It's sort of trying to evoke the time through costume, obviously, and it's a photographic print. Title-wise, it's meant to evoke a slightly later painter, Artemisia Gentileschi, who's at 1594 to 1654. She's another painter who is seen as somebody who is regarded much more highly now because of both her portraits and her historical subject paintings. That is interesting. You get this thing where they make a portrait, or in this case, an engraving, right? But it's based on an earlier painting. It's interesting that the idea of like doing an engraving from after Peter Paul Rubens, after Titian. So that's supposed to be a representation of Dante in the first page, of the book. Make him look rather like he's almost like etched in marble. And this edition was 1584, which would be a century after the first printed versions of it. It's interesting to see these little prints, though, the printmaking that was going on at the time. This is supposed to be a portrait of Sophonies Anguissola. It's like a print made from the painting that was originally done of her by Anthony Van Dyck. This show made me think about the first really breakthrough book about her, which was written and researched over many years by a woman who taught at San Diego State University in women's studies, Ilyasandra Perlingieri. I think she deserves due credit for doing this kind of big breakthrough book. Bernardino Campi is painting Sophonisba Anguissola, and it's a very clever self-portrait because it actually shows her being painted by another artist. I don't think it was like a typical thing for every painter to do. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that she wanted to paint the painter painting her. Maybe she felt that it elevated her because that painter was notable in her time, elevating her as a painter and legitimizing her. Because let's face it, women painters were really unusual for that period. She did many self-portraits and I think was quite a skillful self-portraitist, even, painting herself when she was of elderly age. Most painters at that time did paint self-portraits. Of course, a famous example being Rembrandt painted lots of self-portraits. I think that the better portrait painters of that period were humanizing people, sort of along with the idea of the rise of humanism, right, in writing as well, that you made people seem individual and more real rather than just simply representatives of a sort of symbolic nature. I think she tried for that kind of realism, which was a certain kind of realism that the Renaissance cultivated that people saw it as an advance over medieval painting, for example, where everybody was kind of more flat and sort of looked more pictographic, where it seems like an individual you're looking at rather than just a kind of an archetype. Thank you for watching this episode on the Timken Museum of Art and their current exhibition, which ends on March 29. And thank you for watching the channel, and please subscribe. Also, the next episode will be on the Monuments exhibition, which is at two spaces in LA, the Geffen Contemporary in Little Tokyo, and also the Brick in Los Angeles.